further ado, I'm so blessed to be here with these incredible leaders. We have first Tavai Samuelu. We have Becky Masaki. The incredible Mia Mingus. Goia. And Dr. Jen Fang. We're all just meeting. So this is just going to be a conversation, a light conversation about violence, resistance, and activism. So first, in your introductions, could you tell us a little bit about who you are? But how did you come to this role as a community leader? We can start. Let's just start right next to me with Mia.
I sat here so I wouldn't have to start.
Oh.
No, it's okay. Hi, everyone. How are you? How did I come to my role as a community leader? A lot of the work that I am engaged in, which is mostly disability justice work and transformative justice work, I started doing because there was just not much of that work happening, and especially around disability work, I was searching for so many folks who were like me, who were queer, disabled women of color, adoptees, survivor, et cetera, and I just didn't find that many intersectional conversations about disability or didn't find in movement spaces that we were talking about disability or ableism enough. And then with violence, I was raised around a direct service organization that helped victims of domestic violence, rape, sexual assault, and from there, realized that I wanted to not just be part of addressing the consequences of violence and the needs of violence, but also figuring out how to make the violence stop.
Hi everyone, my name is Jen. I started Reappropriate, which is the nation's oldest and longest running Asian American feminist blog, as far as I know. I started it in late 2001, so it's been part of my life for almost 20 years now. I started it's kind of interesting because I started it not intending to be a community leader or anything like that. I was motivated to start Reappropriate because I wanted to address what I saw was a suppression or a lack of exposure of Asian American feminist and female voices. I believe that media, just as we heard from that amazing speech from Killer Bee, that media shapes the way that we think of consciousness, think of our own identities, and that a lot of that has been taken from us as Asian American women. We have not had the power and the agency to shape our own narratives in the media. And a lot of the frameworks of the way that we think about who we are has really been defined through non-Asian American women framed stories. And so I wanted to change that as a college student. So I created Reappropriate as a place that I hoped could uplift our voices and really retell our stories, reappropriate our narratives. And so that is sort of the story of how Reappropriate came to be. And now it is a space where I hope to give that platform to women like yourselves to bring more voices to the fore.
Thank you for everything that you do. Hi, everyone. My name is Goia Yang, and I'm with the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center, also known as CRAG. Hey. Before I say, how I came into this role, I really just want to give it up to Connie and her entire crew can we just give some love for really creating a space for API women to come together and to really, bring together our minds and our hearts. We know that these spaces are not common, and so I really just want to give it up to them, and also to all of my ancestors and my elders and, my family and my friends who have been folks whose shoulders I've stood on and continue to stand on, and also to recognize that there's so many giants in the room, right? And I get to be next to one like an OG. So I say all of that to say that folks have been in the resistance and in the movement for a long time, way before I was even born, right? And, I grew up in Sacramento and Del Paso Heights, and I know there's some Del Paso Heights folks in the room. But, honestly, when I was in high school, that was the first time that I really felt the power of my voice and my action. And I think that
at that moment, I realized that my calling in life is to really serve the people. And so it has been a journey where, I really learned to serve my own community in Del Paso Heights, and then being able to go to a place like UC Berkeley, and, we have our own criticism about these institutions, but the reality is that, there were folks that came before us who was really able to build a space where I can come in and really be able to learn about, the Third World Liberation Front, ethnic studies, all of that, and really to kind of combine, what it means to be a Southeast Asian kid, at the same time, being able to carry on this legacy of organizing and resisting. And that's kind of been who I am. I was able to come out, get my training in Oakland with Youth Together, and I also then served with Banteisre. And I think it got to the point where I was like, I really want to also be about working in a space that really creates systemic change. And it was just timely where CRAC and I were able to find each other at the same time. So I feel like, whatever comes after CRAC, I know that it's always going to be in the community.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Becky, and thank you for claiming me as OG. And that is like not for original gangsta, but original girl power, right? And I will own that. I guess this whole thing about being a community leader, I find it so interesting at all of the panels and those who've been up at the front of the stage before us. They're all saying, "Oh, well, I'm not really a leader," or they're not claiming that leadership. But all of us are leaders. Everybody who's here, whether you're here in the front of the room or all of you out here. We are leaders, and I feel like for me, what's helped me own that and also really be proud about is shared leadership. That the way that I've designed leadership, the way that I show up is really about strength in numbers. It is that shared leadership. So in that way, and now even in my later generations or iterations, I still really hold that dear. And I feel like how I came into this is not thinking I was a leader, but also to address race and gender equity. I was the first and only person that was hired at a domestic violence shelter. And that shelter, I faced a lot of racism and isolation. And then I left that position thinking it was the field of domestic violence that was racist, that I wouldn't be able to belong in. But because of survivors, many of, like you, your families, those who we stand on the shoulders of, I felt like I could not let go of addressing anti-violence, work. And so that was part of my starting Asian Women's Shelter, and really also could not do that without the co-leadership and coming together as Asian women and continuing.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tavai Samwalu. I am the Executive Director of Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, also known as AAPI. Yes. Okay, I could tell you about myself, but I think it's more important that you understand what a faumo is. Can I get it one more time? There you go. That's that sort of beautiful, mana-filled thing that you get when PIs are in the room to love on each other. It's also an incredible metaphor for this work and our movement, right? It's loud because we've been silenced for too long. It's urgent because who the hell wants to wait for liberation, right? Like our movements, it comes from the very core of who you are. And it's joyful. It's so joyful. And as a person who pain may have brought me here, but it definitely can't sustain me in this shit, it's joyful because when we raise our voices against injustice, it is this beautiful celebration of the most courageous parts of our humanity. Shit, why am I about to cry? So I think this question of a community leader and how I came to be here is probably the one that gave me the most pause. I've been in this role for a little over a year. It is the most humbling and challenging thing I have ever done. I am often the go-to token PI. I'll own it, I'll say it. And really in conflict because I have spent most of my life being ostracized by the Pacific Islander community. And the irony is I work at an organization full of PIs and we have these conversations with the young people that we work with where we're all running around not feeling PI enough. And that when we ask each other, like, well, what does it mean to be PI? It's Christian, it's hetero, it's male, it's, PIs don't go to school, PIs don't vote, these incredibly problematic things that I don't know that we ever got to decide. So this like battle for cultural sovereignty is something that keeps me here. And this other belief, right, this standing on shoulders of giants, I talked a lot about transformational reciprocity. I think Tongans have like tauhiba, right, this understanding that your very presence has an impact, so you want to be intentional about it. And that it's not the quid pro quo that white supremacy will tell you about, that colonialism will tell you about, that it's this understanding that like, there's so many people who came before you that built that space, that made that possible. And so it is to give back to those who came before you and forward to those who will follow. And the idea that humans who didn't even know me created this space where I could practice leadership and reconcile some of my shit around ethnic and racial identity is, it's a beautiful struggle. Yeah. So thank you.
Woo! Feeling all the feels now. Each of you in your responses was a reminder of this calling, that so much of this is bigger than any of us, and there's not a lot of words for that feeling sometimes, right? It's why we're feeling maybe the tears come up or that little bubble in your tummy or a little anxiousness. That's our ancestors speaking through us. That's all the OGs speaking through us. This work is nothing without every single person in this room. So thank you for just an incredible intro. I want to come back to Becky. You were talking a little bit around sort of the isolation you were feeling in the movement and just also in the workspace. So to you, what are the issues of violence, diversely defined and intersectional, which I know you'll do, that are impacting Asian and Pacific Islander communities, particularly regarding your area of expertise?
Things I was thinking about is, let's see, okay, just lots of things I could talk about, but one was I was thinking about the issues of violence that many times us as API community aren't recognized for that aspect, and we are our whole people. So there's a lot of who comprise us, our identities, or the ways that we are both strong and wonderful and whole people, and also the things that might be impacting us. An example of that is, for example, this idea of the, traumatic, like the impact of vicarious trauma, right? And so in the domestic violence field, for example, in the dominant white culture aspect of the anti-domestic violence work, they think about that, oh yeah, we're gonna do stuff about trauma-informed work. And, like these exercises, which, yes, is good, and they're like focused on somebody's experience of domestic violence or sexual assault, and certainly that's aspect of it. But our people are dealing with layers of violence and layers of trauma. And so, in fact, even for ourselves, like the advocates, the ones that are working, many of us have survived, are survivors of personal trauma, but also the trauma of our nationhood, you know. So things like for myself as third generation Japanese American, born and raised here in California, I still actually carry some of the trauma of the Japanese incarceration camp that my parents and my grandparents went through. And it's odd because I myself didn't experience it, but it is real, right? Because it's part of the thread of what we've carried. Like an example of that is so much so when I was in after a traumatic accident like that was myself, like injured and recovering, I kept thinking that the assisted living facility that I was at, just right here in San Leandro, they're trying to help me, but I kept thinking I was like in a incarceration camp, and I kept going, I'm going to convince you that I can be released, and different things like that. And I also notice with our sisters, say in whose ancestors or people have been in slavery here in the U.S. in the South, and that in their times of trauma, or now with Black Lives Matter, or different kinds of the continuing traumas that are facing our people and our communities, that triggers up, right? So I do feel like it is like not ignoring that, it's not over, and there is also that we're here, we're alive, we're here. All of us here, we're here. And so there is those pathways to overcoming.
Thank you. I'm going to tee it over to the same question to Goya.
Yeah, so Tavai and I were joking about this, like our area of expertise is like our people. So where do we start? But I think, maybe folks have mentioned this throughout the day, but for Southeast Asian Americans, when I'm talking about them, I'm talking about the folks that came here as refugees impacted by the wars in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, right? And so before we even think about like the violence that exists today for our communities, we have to also remember the colonization that happened in that area, the imperialism that happened in that area, U.S. military, right, war, and then coming here to stolen lands, and this land being founded on white supremacy. So that in itself is also already many, many layers that Southeast Asian refugees did not even get a chance to unpack, and some still don't to this day, right? To unpack that and to really think about, what has been the intergenerational trauma and how that impacts folks like me who's second generation Hmong American, right? And I know that there's like scientific studies that has been done around how unaddressed intergenerational trauma then gets impacted and passed on through your DNA. Well, the one thing that also gets passed on is, this ability to resist and to fight back, right? And so that's why I'm just so thankful to be Hmong, because our communities have been, attacked even before the wars in Southeast Asia. I think one thing also to really address the elephant in the room is the fact that we also have a lot of interethnic history that has a lot of violence that we oftentimes don't get to talk about. So there's many, many layers, and then to think about refugees being resettled in low-income communities that already did not have the appropriate resources, right? And to bring in another community that, would be fighting for these crumbs. also created multiple layers of violence, and how the institutional impacts the interpersonal, and how that then impacts the individual, right? So for me, you know, I knew that I didn't know all these words when I was growing up, but I knew that something just did not feel right. And you know that it was weird that my parents would be fighting about finances, and that this was called domestic violence, right? So these are things that you know impact an individual, and that as a young Southeast Asian woman growing up, then I was also feeling like, okay, where do I go to feel some form of belonging, or you know, some form of love, and being able like watching Full House, and you know, why don't I get that kind of love, right? Like that's real, right? And so for me, I did what I felt was empowering, and that was like seeking love from an older young individual, you know. But had I knew better, had I had more resources, that wouldn't have been my path, right? But because that is my path, that's why I always feel so indebted to serving, honestly, the younger version of Goia. Um, oh, girl, I'm feeling it too, you know? Um, but for reals, it's like just knowing that I do this because I want to make sure that folks don't have to go through what I had to go through, or folks who had it worse than me. So these are all the various layers of violence that exist, and to, you know, continue to um, have to keep fighting, right? Whether it's like about let's get access to more mental health services, let's, you know, make sure that our community's voices are being heard, because it's not like our stories are not being told, they're not being heard. Let's keep it real, right? But also like what Joyce and Eddie and Nia talked about is that our communities continue to be impacted by deportation, and how this impacts the women then who are at home and have to stay back, right? Because then their partners are the ones that are getting deported. So, you know, just thinking about how AAPI women, we have always been at the forefront of the fight, you know, whether it's for our family, for our communities, for, you know, people of color, for liberation. But we're always the one, so we've always been the ones that are fighting, but oftentimes no one's fighting for us, you know? And so just really, again, feel really blessed to be in this sort of space where we can really feel like, you know, I'm in solidarity with my sister Tavai, and we're fighting it together, right? And again, she is an original gangster, even though she doesn't want to claim it. But you know what I mean? Like, honestly, I feel just really blessed to be in community together, where we are really redefining what it means to be in a community, and that it's from a place of love and not just always like a place of like trying to survive.
This ish is deep, you guys. It's deep. I want to hear from Dr. Fang, because you have a, you know, with Reappropriate and with sharing narratives, I want to have the same question to you around what are the issues of violence that are impacting API communities?
Well, I think one of the common threads that's coming up right now is the issue of voice and the lack thereof, and the suppression of our voices by just white supremacy, by patriarchy. And what I really wanted to address in my work was the ways in which the ways that we have not been able to shape our own narratives has affected us and caused trauma against us, such that we can't even have the language or the space to question who we are and to build ourselves up as strong people, as strong women. So I think back to when I was a college student, and I came to this work through ethnic studies, and that was very formative for me. But one thing that I felt was lacking in sort of the traditional way that we learn about our history, if we're privileged enough to do that in a formal classroom, is the ways in which we don't hear about Asian American women and how we've been at the forefront of this fight. You know, we learn about Chinese exclusion, but we don't learn about Chinese American women and how we were excluded by law over a decade before the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and how the invisibility of women in that history is a powerful part of our history and the Chinese American historical narrative. And yet we have no space to unpack that. We have no language to unpack that. And we don't have any way to think about how that intergenerational, that historical memory of trauma affects us now, right? And so, I'm in my day job, I'm a scientist, right? So I know this study, right, of how trauma is passed down through our DNA, through epigenetic modifications, and so it affects our behavior, our perspectives. These traumas that our parents go through affects the way that we view the world and the way that we view ourselves. And I think that's deeply violent, that we don't have any space or any infrastructure, any language, any way to fight back against the ways that we've been invisibilized in our history. So for me, I see all of this as, the sort of common thread is that our voices were taken, our stories were taken, our ability to question the role that we're supposed to play in this white supremacist patriarchal world has been taken from us. And so we, without spaces like this, we don't question whether or not we should be meek and apolitical and just accept the violence around us. And so I see this as an act of resistance and an act of liberation, because it gives us a space to start to ask those questions and shape those narratives and to really do the work of taking back who we are for ourselves.
I'm going to switch it up a little bit. Switch it up. What are the ways that you or your organization has been working towards ending violence?
How long do you all have? Hi. So I am with the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective out here, the BATJC, and we are specifically working to build and support transformative justice responses to child sexual abuse. And because child sexual abuse, or CSA, is bound up with all different other types of violence, we end up working on all different types of violence, but especially mostly domestic and sexual violence. And so one of the ways that we are doing this is we are trying to get folks just like you all here to think about how do we build the community infrastructure that we need to be able to respond to violence within our own communities in ways that are transformative and generative and that don't rely on the very systems that we know are erasing us and other folks that we love. And we sit in these rooms, and I know, there's so much pain, and there's so much we can say about state violence, but also there is so much violence happening in our families, in our relationships, between each other, even here, in our friendships, in our movements, in our political work. And so I know that in our political movements, we tend to be so much better at talking about state violence. And we can talk about gentrification and colonization and imperialism and global capitalism. We can talk about that all day long. But then when we ask people to talk for an hour about rape or sexual assault, they're like, oh, I don't know if I can handle that, right? I need a trigger warning. I can't, no, this is too much. But it's like we just spent forever talking about these gut-wrenching things. Why does this keep happening? And especially when we talk about child sexual abuse, we often frame it as these are the building blocks of oppression. This is the first place where the most vulnerable members of our community are learning firsthand about what power and control looks like, shame and blame, silence looks like. And if we can build a world where children are safe, it will be a world where we are all safe. Why is it that we can't even keep children and youth, our children and our youth, safe from us, from their family, their kin, their community? I'm not talking about a white police officer. I'm not talking about getting deported. I'm not talking about getting displaced. Yes, those are real threats. I'm talking about just within our folks. Why can't our children and youth be safe? Why is that? Why do we live in a world like that? Why have we built a collective culture where we can't even ask somebody about their parenting, where that's considered taboo or rude? Why is that? So that is the work that we are trying to do, and we are trying to figure out what will it take to build up community infrastructure that's more than just your friends getting together when somebody gets sexually assaulted and trying to help out. That's great. We don't want to lose that, but we also want to build more formalized community infrastructure. What does that look like, right? What does it look like to have safe houses, maybe a network of underground safe houses in our communities where folks could go? We don't need the state. We don't need to keep relying on these systems that are already harming us. We have to figure out a way to, I think, invest half, if not more, of our resources into our intimate networks and how to do this work around our kitchen tables. Because a lot of us, I know, we could have an hour-long, hours and hours and hours-long conversations at conferences about all these political issues, but if we talk to our family about it, forget it. Why is that? We gotta shift that, you all. We have to, because also when we think about our political movements, we have to fight back against state violence. Absolutely. I'm not saying that that's not important. We have to do both, though. And we can't be relying on state violence as we're trying to push back against it. But also, when we think about our political movements, all of this intimate and sexual violence underneath the domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, child sexual abuse, that creates an unstable foundation on which our movements then rest. So doing this work helps our movements as well. And let's be real, Black, Indigenous, women of color, we have been at the forefront saying we cannot use the police, for example, to respond to intimate and sexual violence. We can't keep using the state. So that's a little bit about what our work does. And we primarily, all of that work, what we call it is transformative justice. What does justice look like outside of the courts? What does justice look like outside of a conviction? I would ask everybody here in this room, for any time you've been wronged, what would justice have looked like for you? And anybody in this room also, when you have done harm, because most of us have done harm or been complicit in harm in some way, shape, or form, even if it's just through our privileges, what would justice have looked like for you then, too?
The other OG. Tamai, do you want to follow that question? What are some ways that you or your org have been working towards ending violence?
I saw you give me the look, and I was like, oh, it's going to come my way. Okay. Oh, that's my best friend. I'm just going to sit here for a second, breathe. I had like 3 or 4 epiphanies while you were talking, so good one.
It's so hard not to jump in
Right?
with her.
Yeah, it's amazing. And you just like fucked me up, but like in the best way possible. Y'all are really, like, you're just gonna bear witness to me like working through a lot of my trauma today and just like healing with an audience, which is something I am petrified about. So when I think about violence, I think about, so Ruthie Gilmore, brilliant woman, defines violence as any act that leads to premature death. And like to operate from that place is to open up yourself and also understand how violent this world is and how capable we are of violence towards ourselves and towards each other. So, she specifically talks about racism and poverty being state-sanctioned violence. But there's this other piece of like, when I think about the Pacific Islander community, how colonialism and imperialism is the most pervasive violence that we have. I've gone to violence prevention conferences where they want to tell me about the gang violence that PIs commit against each other. And I was like, yeah, and we were never supposed to be here because you fucking went to our shit. Like, there was all these like white people that took turns fucking with our shit and made our islands uninhabitable. I think about erasure and how frequently it happens in our Pacific Islander communities. I think in particular at AAPI, right, I'm supposed to tell you about our leadership development, advocacy, and research. So nicely packaged, right? All siloed and shit, very funder friendly. We had to do leadership development because nobody was trying to develop PI leaders. And hell, no one knew how to, right? People come to us and say like, oh, PIs don't come to this. I was like, no shit, you didn't ask them, right? Or like, you didn't tell. I was like, you didn't have food, but why? Like, why would I come? Or you said that to whose mom? No, we're not gonna do that, right? And so this idea of like, we were the experts on how to talk to our people, and not only were we the experts, we were the only ones who thought it was important to do that, right? We do advocacy because that's That's the systems change that we're trying to push, right? There's so many of these programs that'll tell you about the individual behavior shifts, right? A ton of funding for obesity, for cancer, for all of these things, as if those were things that we were doing to ourselves, right? Like when folks are talking about epigenetics, you wanna tell me, I'm supposed to tell my niece not to eat hot Cheetos? I promise you, like, John Smith III in Piedmont can eat hot Cheetos and be fine. So really, there's no analysis, right? So this advocacy had to be driven by us, had to be centered by us, and then we had to do research. We had to do research because so much of the knowledge production that exists about PIs is not made by or for us, right? Still, in these anthropology buildings, they'll tell you about Margaret Mead and her study coming of age in Samoa, right? And call her the mother of anthropology, who didn't understand Samoans, right? And it was just like, oh, and it's still, to this day, despite the fact that it's been debunked, that so many Samoans laughed and said, like, that's not true, that she is still considered foundational, right? So even when we tell you it's not true, right? And now all of a sudden, everybody's all about their storytelling. Now you want a story bank. When we brought you stories, you asked us for our numbers. You wanted data. And so now we do both, and we're damn good at it. But it's like, but be very clear. I already knew that my very existence was because a great-grandmother told a story, that I was chanted and prayed into existence decades and thousands of millennia ago. And so even, maybe it's best to just to tell you a story. I met this facilitator, brilliant native Hawaiian, Kevin Fong, who shared the story of like the beginnings of the Polynesian Voyaging Society. So Na'Itono Thompson, Native Hawaiians had come together, and this was around the Native Hawaiian Renaissance. They're like, hey, do you know they believe that we accidentally got here? That we just like wandered here? Like, oh, so they searched far and wide the world to find somebody who still knew how to do master navigation. And in Micronesia, they found Maupiliag. So they fly him over to Hawaii, and they say, like, hey, we want to navigate from Hawaii to Tahiti using only Polynesian voyaging. Mao looks at them, he says, okay, has anybody been to Tahiti? No one raises their hands. So he says, in that vast ocean with thousands and thousands of islands where none of you have been there before, how will you know which one is Tahiti? Right? And I share this story to say that when we dream and when we vision with our young people, when we talk to them, when you haven't seen healing, how will you know what it looks like? When you haven't seen justice, how will you know what it looks like? When you haven't seen liberation, how will you know? And so we have this collective visioning. And so the thing that Mao did with them, he took them to the highest point in Hawaii. He had them all sit down, and he had them look out onto the ocean. He said, all right, we're going to sit and we're going to think about it. So over days, each person would raise their hands like, oh, I think I got it. Tahiti looks like this. I was like, okay, share it with everybody. They think about it. I was like, go sit and think about it some more. I was like, okay, I got it. I think it looks like this. Until at the end, they had decided, had this collective, deep-seated spiritual understanding of what Tahiti looked like. So then they're out in the ocean, reading the stars and the waves and the sun and the wind, that they would understand at their very core what Tahiti looked like. So I think when in this like newest version of Epic that I have been entrusted to enact and realize is that we are doing a lot of collective visioning and a lot of challenging each other to center healing. And I think this other part that we've had to talk a lot about is burnout. That we come to this burnt out, that we come to the work because we're in pain, but we also don't get to put it away, and that we inherit more of it and get more of it. And so I shared with my staff, I was like, yeah, I'm so sorry, I'm so burnt out, and I've been trying really hard not to hurt anybody with it. So I held it all together and was trying to be functional. And so this sort of like if we had a shared collective language around how violent it is to demand that people function in burnout.
As the resident scientist. For those of you who don't know my history, I am actually, my PhD is actually in biology. I'm a vascular biologist, and I'm a postdoc right now. So I feel a little bit able to answer this question. I cannot tell you which study it is, because I don't have that off the top of my head. But I can tell you how this generally works. So we have DNA in our bodies. And if you remember back to sort of a textbook of how that works, your DNA is sort of the script that allows your cells to make proteins, and proteins are the machines that make your cell function. So DNA is basically the master code for you. It turns out that your DNA is not just the A's and C's and G's and T's that are inside the 4 base codes, if you remember that code for every gene. There's additional layer of regulation that decides how we read this code, and that's called epigenetic modifications. So that you add a little tag on a gene and it says, read this one more, or read this one less. And it turns out that as much as we inherit the A's and C's and G's and T's from our moms and dads, we also inherit these little extra tags. And those tags don't come from during when you're making another person. Those come from modifications that occur as we live. So us just sitting here and experiencing our lives are going through experiences that affect whether or not a tag will be placed on a gene. So for example, if you go through a lot of trauma, say you're going through the violence of war, that high level of anxiety that you're feeling on a constant basis will put your body in a state where it says, I need to do something about changing the way my body functions so I can cope and survive this. So I'll put some tags here on this gene, and I'll put some tags here on this gene, and that will help me to survive. Those tags stay with our children and our grandchildren, and they get changed by different experiences eventually a few generations down. Then they maybe don't have that level of trauma, and eventually you can start to take those tags away. But we give those tags. Every experience in your life gets passed on. And that, I think, is a great analogy for how our work works, right? Everything that we do, everything that we experience is something that is paving the way for better or for worse for those who come after us.
Fascinating. Do we have another question? Okay, I'm going to move on then. Our last question to each of you is, what suggestions do you have to the attendees on how to help end violence in the API community? Yeah, let's just go down the line. All right.
Hi. One thing that I would say, we call, in the BATJC, we're building pods, and we're encouraging people to build their own pods. So I would say that for you all, that's one concrete thing, is that you can think of your pod are the people that you would call on in your life if violence happened to you, if you were experiencing violence. So whether you were doing the violence, whether you might do the violence, or whether you were surviving the violence or witnessing the violence, who are the people in your life, like right now, you think in your head that you would call on, that you know you could rely on? If you're like, I gotta get out of my house, I gotta move out of my house right now, I gotta get out of this abusive situation, or if you got beat up on the street, who are the people in your life that you could call on? If you have kids, who are your kids' pod? Who are the people that your kid can turn to if something happened? So that's what I would say. You can go to our website, which is just batjc.wordpress.com, and you can read more about, we have a whole write-up about it, as well as a worksheet, so you can actually fill out who your pod is, and then try to deepen and expand those relationships. Because if we're not gonna use prisons, and if we're not gonna use police or the courts, then who the hell are those people gonna be? So we got to start building these kind of relationships. Build a pod that, and they may not be the same people. You might have multiple pods. So your pod who you might turn to for your own accountability might be different than the people you would turn to for surviving violence. Your pod people. I don't know how much more sci-fi we can get you all. So that's what I would recommend, because this is how we start to build in that infrastructure. And every person here, you should not be the people who are only taking care and helping other people and helping to advocate for other people. Every person on this panel, you should also have people in your life that you can turn to if something happened to you. And that's what I find most often is that a lot of us doing this work, we actually don't build up our own support. And that's just basic integrity. We can't ask other people to do things that we're not willing to do. So if we want other people to be accountable, we got to work on our own accountability.
Dr. Fang, your suggestions?
So I think that the reason that I'm here amongst these amazing folks, these are all my heroes, by the way. So I'm just impressed and happy to be here. I think the role that I fulfill now is to create a place for stories, to create a place to be for people to be storytellers. Again, this is connecting back to me talking about how the erasure of our voices has affected us so deeply intergenerationally. And personally. So in terms of things that we can do tangibly to affect that, I believe the first thing we really need to be doing is to look deep within ourselves and to always hold ourselves accountable to doing that every single day. I think that part of telling stories is to first listen to ourselves and listen to our own stories. And I think that that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. I think part of the lessons that I've learned in running Reappropriate is that I'm always learning. I'm learning from all of y'all. I'm learning from everybody on this panel. And I'm learning from myself. And I'm always open to trying to hear other people and hear other stories. And I think that that's essential for us because we've spent so much time being silenced and not hearing the diverse voices that are the Asian American and the Asian American women's community. I think the second thing that we really need to do is learn to step aside. So that means as we listen to ourselves, to also hold ourselves accountable to think about the privileges that we carry with us and try not to enact violence against others around us. Part of that is to acknowledge the ways that we have power and that we can enact violence and to try our best to not do that. And to be humble when we do that, because we will. One thing that I've been really trying to do for myself is to learn to step aside. So I'm privileged and blessed to have a large platform with Reappropriate, and one thing that I've been doing in the last few years is making it available for anybody else, because I don't want my voice to dominate. I want everyone's voices to dominate. And so part of that is to learn to be very generous with the power that you have and step aside so that marginalized voices in our midst can take some of that and, be uplifted and be amplified and be heard, because those are the voices we really need to hear. So those are the two things I would think you could tangibly do.
Thank you. What Jen said. No, I mean, honestly, Jen, I've never had a chance to thank you, but when CRAC, we were running our data disaggregation bill, nobody wanted to do a story on data disaggregation because it's not sexy, and unfortunately, our biggest opposition was also Asian, but Jen was the one that was like, yo, I will run a story for y'all. And so I really feel like you are so true to your words. Thank you so much. For me with CRAG, we are about, the institutional change, but personally, I'm always about the individual, right? So I agree 100% with what has been said. We really have to be really honest with ourselves. Like when we're feeling like, yo, I'm getting really burnt out, I need to go take care of myself. And it's true, go take care of yourself. And create that pod so that they could keep you accountable, right? Of taking care of yourself and giving yourself grace and giving yourself permission. It's so weird. Like, I don't know why I'm also guilty of this, but I wait for others to give me permission to go take care of myself. And I think for me, like, my healing is to be able to not get to that point where I'm giving myself permission to take care of me so that I can have, more energy to love and more energy to organize and more energy to put in the work, right? So I really feel like, the violence really does end with me, and I need to stop being so violent towards myself.
Thank you. Yes. I mean, what everybody said so far, so thank you for that. I think just what I could add building on that is interconnectedness and interdependence. So interdependence, for example, when I started the well, when I was working in domestic violence, they're like, yes, we want, survivors to be independent. It's gaining your independence. And thinking only about like the relationship, well, which is important, but we're more than a relationship. And so it's not just a single person, but it's like folks were worried about. So let me give you an example. In LGBT community, many API LGBT folks had actually moved in the Bay Area to be in a place where they could belong. And so the API LGBT community is their family. And so then when there was a abusive relationship or sexual violence, then who do you turn to, or like be blamed, or you don't want to, triple out your community and your family. And so what we realized is, it's not just about that one perpetrator or person who does harm, but it's how are we changing our family. It's like creating a positive community, a positive extended family. And we know how to do that, right? Because we know about extended families and community. And so that's, I think, the other side of that is using the strength of that to break through, I think, the isolation.
And I got a lot of questions, but do you want to answer one thing attendees can do?
Shit. Ditto.
Ditto.
I think the first thing I thought about was this idea around, given how pervasive violence is with this like Ruth E. Gilmore definition, it's like making the decision and taking the conscientious stance that violence is not an acceptable strategy to meet a need. I think there's also ways that like violence has been, I think in the Pacific Islander community, sometimes we joke about violence. Like we laugh about some of the violence that we experience so we don't cry ourselves to sleep at night. And I think having a deep-seated understanding and like an outward message that like violence is not only unacceptable as a strategy, it's also not inevitable and it's not normal. It is absolutely not normal, right? And so I think this piece around like healing and I'm gonna stop there and just wait for the next question. Thanks.
Thank you, Dubai. This question will be quick. This event is extremely educational. Will it be shared somewhere or recorded? I'm going to direct everyone to check out the Facebook, the Twitter. There's hashtags on one of the flyers around here I saw. It was hashtag AAPI, hashtag I'm Ready Movement. So direct you guys to those places to look for more info. This next question is a good one. It's a juicy, loaded question. So one response is, come talk to me after this. I'd love to talk about this. But I am a law student hoping to become a prosecutor. Specifically, I want to prosecute sex crimes like human trafficking and child exploitation. But law enforcement tends to not work for people of color. How can I reconcile the two?
Well, I mean, one thing is to work with advocates, work with the people. So that would be my advice. Like that's where I felt like the recipe for the DAs are those that could really listen and work with advocates or community folks that then together could create a team for, I guess, our definition of justice, right?
I'm just going to jump in on this and say, okay, so background, my partner is in law school right now, so he feels your pain, whoever wrote this question. He is also grappling with a similar question because he is interested in criminal justice as well, and as a black man, he feels this tension between, you know, being a law student and wanting to help with criminal justice, but also how do you ethically be a prosecutor? And I will just, for whoever wrote this question, there's actually a ton of scholarship on this, which I only know about through dinner table conversations, so I couldn't tell you where it is. But apparently there's like law review, like entire issues written on the ethical quandary of being a person of color who wants to work on criminal justice in a system that hurts people of color. I think that just, you know, the very simple answer is to be aware of this issue, make these connections, as Becky said, know that there is a quandary there, and do what you can. If you're going to join the system, understand that the system is unfair, and understand that you have some ways, limited ways, but some ways where you can affect it. As a prosecutor, you do have prosecutorial discretion. And those are things that you can exercise. You can try to mentor other lawyers of color and try to change the field that way. And also, you can fight in the system to end the system and how it's unfair and change it to something radically different, something that actually is equity for people of color.
I just want to add one thing, because I second all of this, and maybe just a frame that might help is the way that I would think about that work is it's harm reduction work. It's the same way that I think about voting. Voting is not where the revolution is going to happen, and it's imperative that we vote. Like because there's so many folks who don't have the luxury of not being bound up in the system, and so many people who aren't able to vote. So we have to vote. Like, to me, being part of the system, it's not like an either or. These binaries are just killing us, you all. It's not like an either or thing. It's not like, oh, you work for the man, so you suck. No, it's like we need everybody at every different point, and there's so many different strategic roles to play. Some of us might want to work more off the grid. Awesome. Some of us might want to work inside the system and chip away at it. Awesome, do that. But understand that it's harm reduction, that it's not the end all be all. You know, like, yeah, getting a Hollywood movie might be like something that kids need to see reflections of themselves in the media. That's harm reduction. You know, getting more disabled actors on TV, that's amazing for disabled kids to see. And I also know that's not the end all be all. That's not where my liberation is. But also, there are things that we can do that will help to alleviate some of the harm. And especially when we talk about the criminal legal system and just state systems in general, like the medical industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, whatever we're talking about, folks we need to reduce harm in those systems, because right now we don't have a choice of whether or not our folks are going in. So we need people at all different stages. So I don't know if that helps you all too in terms of that question.
I just want to jump in one more thing on that and just say, just to emphasize that point, if you do decide to join the system, it can feel like harm reduction, and it is harm reduction, but to the one person whom you might exercise your prosecutorial discretion towards and maybe keep them out of jail, it's the world. So just remember that that's an impact for one person. You have meant the difference between potentially life and death.
Thank you, guys. Last one, open up to anyone. Is this on? Would you say saving face and the role of shaming and silencing are some of the tags that have been passed on to us? Would you say saving face and the role of shaming and silencing are some of the tags that have been passed on to us?
When you say tags, you mean like the epigenetic
Because I used
tags?
that analogy.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to figure out how to pronounce that word, by the way.
Epigenetic.
Epigenetic.
Like genetic with epi in front of it.
Person who wrote that, I think that's what it meant.
I want to, but I want to sit with it, if it's okay. I know, like we don't have a whole lot of time, but I also want to give you like a thoughtful answer. I just, take a little bit to process.
So I just want to emphasize, since I've introduced this to the whole conversation, it is to some degree, it is absolute science, but it's also an analogy, right? So the things that we're just, by the way, from the scientific perspective, epigenetics is a hot field. We don't fully understand it yet. Okay, so it's one of those things where what's being passed on is a memory of life experiences, of certain states that we're in, certain states of fear, anxiety, sadness, joy, safety, security. Those experiences become a biological memory for us. It's not as granular as like, I had a really great day, there's a tag in my DNA that says I had a really great day. But your body does remember if you lived a life of fear or violence, because your body changes itself to survive that. And one thing I didn't mention is that those tags have very serious consequences towards health. You know, things like diabetes, obesity, hypertension. These are all more prevalent amongst peoples who have this epigenetic memory of violence and trauma. We do know that biologically. So in terms of this question of, is there a tag for saving face or being quiet? I think that that might be maybe stretching the analogy a little too far, but I can absolutely say that there is a cultural memory or tag of feeling like we should allow ourselves to be silent, to be invisible, to maybe as women step aside and not let our narratives be the center and be the spotlight. I think that we have that kind of cultural, racial memory of surviving systems of white supremacy, systems of patriarchy that have led us to this tag, quote unquote, not a real biological tag, but a tag of surviving that through the learned behaviors of not allowing yourselves to be the center of attention.
I don't have a scientific answer, but my answer is no. Um, I say no because, I mean, we wouldn't be here, right? Let's keep it real. We would not be here. We would not be talking about all the work that we've been doing. We would not be talking about, you know, creating spaces for our stories to be heard, right? And I think it's also part of our healing, right? Is that, you know, we are doing this not just for ourselves, but for our ancestors. And our ancestors have fought for us, you know, and they continue to fight with us. I also want to really uplift Mia's work. I mean, if folks are like really wanting to think about how do you like take these tags off, go to her trainings. You know, she will teach you how to do transformative justice. And so, you know, my answer is no.
So I often joke with people that I have been carefully crafted by shame. A lifelong, recovering overachiever and perfectionist. That people were like, oh, how are you like that? How are you so, you know, how are you able to get to Berkeley when they don't have PIs there? How are you doing? And a lot of it, like, I spent a lot of time being shamed. The necessity to come back to my community was to reconcile all of the things that I had been shamed about. The shit that I carry around about not being PI enough, that's shame. And a lot of it is, like, shame is not a bad feeling. Like, there's no, like, good or bad feelings or whatever. Like, emotions are a tool, right? And so then I went all the way to the opposite. I was like, well, I don't want to feel shame about anything. I'm going to be shameless. And then I forgot. I was like, whoa, like, what do I feel shame about? How is it useful? And I think there was also this, like, oh, shame is a cultural practice. It's like, not, like, it's a tool that has been used to train people, right? It's a Pavlovian response to things. It's like, let me not do that so I don't feel ashamed. Let me not be that. And, like, really this, like, on some, like, Brene Brown shit of shame really being this fear of disconnection, right? Are we ashamed, or actually we are so petrified of being disconnected, of all of the ways that people will not claim us or own us anymore, of, like, all of the ways we won't belong. And how incredibly brave it is to actually be willing to stand alone. And when I say the things that I'm most scared of, the, like, reactions of support, to, like, name that high lonesome feeling of, like, oh, we all feel that alone? We all run around not feeling enough? And so is shaming and silencing, I don't think it lives in our genetics, but I do think it's a codified practice that doesn't belong to one ethnicity or culture, that it's actually something that, like, is driven also, like, that people benefit from, right? I also think about this piece of, you know, as you talk about epigenetics, I believe in epigenetics. I understand it to be true. And I am so wary of biological arguments because it wasn't that long ago when they were used to, like, disenfranchise our people. when they were used to defend and support white supremacy. And also, if one more person tells me they're 23andMe genetic breed, right? It's like, how can I be racist? I'm 11% Cherokee. No, don't do it. Just don't do it. And so I think like holding that as something that can validate, that can support that logic that you like at your core know to be true, right? And so wanting to offer that like there is that shame and feelings and emotions are not the bad thing. It's sort of your response and your reaction and what you decide to do with it. And the ways in which like this is the first piece of cultural sovereignty, right? Like of how you get to determine what is and what isn't. And that the first thing, the most dehumanizing thing, right, is to decide that the sweeping generalization that this is how everyone is. And to end with this like James Baldwin, right, where James Baldwin says it is dehumanizing to both deify and vilify someone. So to allow someone the full spectrum of their humanity is this sort of maybe the alternative to shaming and silencing.
Thank you so much to our panel. Can you give it up for the panel? And thank you to our audience, to the questions. I think what you heard from a lot of the panelists is that we're all survivors too. Leadership looks really lonely. So to our panelists, we see you, we got you, and we're fighting for you. So thank you.